We lived in Grandview, South Dakota, having moved there in about 1936. We lived in a parsonage out in the country, and this old house had no insulation and not much protection from the wind. It was very cold in there in the wintertime and kind of hot in the summer. I remember the basement was not much more than a hole under the house. There weren't nice cement walls, but it was just dirt walls with kind of a cement plaster over the top of them. And we would go down there sometimes if we had a storm. There was an old trap door out in the front porch that we'd have to open to walk down the stairs. And there was no light down there because we had no electricity. So we'd use a flashlight or else carried a kerosene lamp down there. I remember one time we had a dust storm. The wind was strong and it blew the dust around so hard that it got dark, and we had to light the lamp and go down there until it blew over, and a lot of dirt blew into the house. In around those 1937 or so is about the first summer that we lived there. My mom gave me haircuts. We had clippers that she had to squeeze the handles together to make it work, a hand clipper. And that thing pulled so hard because it didn't cut real good, and I always hated to have haircuts. And besides that, the hair would get caught down my neck under my shirt and itch. And I was not the only one whose hair she cut. Lyle Grunois came over for haircuts as well. We just about had to make our own entertainment. About that time, Monopoly became a popular game. I don't think we could afford it, so Marvin made a Monopoly game, copying another one on a big piece of cardboard, and he cut out little houses and hotels and made the cards and everything, and used watercolors to paint the colors on it. And we played Monopoly quite often. He also made a Chinese checkerboard by drilling holes in a piece of plywood. And let's see, we had an erector set. That was a lot of fun because we could build things with it using the little screws that came with it to build cars and cranes and different things like that. We also had a carom board. It's kind of like a little tiny pool table with pockets in each corner, and you could flick those caroms into the corner. I also remember my dad and Marvin each were stamp collectors, and Marvin got a big box of stamps one time called the Golden Galleon, and there was like 1,000 stamps in it, and we had a lot of fun with that. One Sunday at church, after church, I was sitting up near the front, and I wanted to get out, but I didn't dare because there was a great big lady standing in the aisle. Afraid of her. I thought she was dangerous or something, mainly because she was so big. So to avoid having to walk past her, I crawled on my hands and knees under all the pews to the back of the church. And I happened to be wearing white pants and got them all dirty, and my mom was so disgusted with me. Out on the stairs of that country church, there was big cement steps with iron railing pipe, big thick pipes for railings. And we would used to play on that railing, and you could bend your waist over it and go round and round. And we were doing that one time, I don't know if it was after church or after catechism or something, and James Rosenbaum pushed me off of it, and I landed with my head on the edge of that step, and I got a big cut in my head. I still have a scar from it. That cut was maybe a ½ inch long, and it was bleeding real hard, and I remember the kids had to walk me to the house, and Mom had to put a wet rag on it to stop the bleeding. I think we're right around 1938, Paul and Marvin were both going to high school in Corsica, and when they had snowstorms, the roads didn't get cleared out very well, and there was a time that they weren't able to get home for about 6 weeks. And then after the 6 weeks, they managed to come home, or one of them did, and quick get some clean clothes, and they had to turn right around because out in the open prairie, the wind would come up again and the roads would be closed again. Marvin and Paul each had a bicycle that they bought from the Montgomery Ward catalog, and in good weather they would ride those way to Corsica to school. I think it was about 5 miles or so. We used to go to Mitchell for major shopping, not very often, only a few times a year, because it was, I think, about 35 miles away or so. And usually you'd have at least one flat tire on a trip like that. Tires weren't very good, and you'd have to stop and take the tire off the rim and put a patch on it, then pump it back up. I remember the time we were in Mitchell, and there was a carnival going on out on the streets, and in one of the places there was a great big snake. I don't know how big it was. It was a big boa constrictor, perhaps. It probably was 8 inches thick. And we would walk around through the carnival and in and out of the dime stores. And I got separated from my mom. I really got worried then, but after wandering around a while, I found her back again. The house we lived in was on a hill on what's now Highway 44. It was just a gravel road then, and the church was sitting just up the hill slightly from the house, and the schoolhouse was to the north, just across a small pasture, not very far away. And on Sunday, I remember one of the families by the name of Stoutham's came to church with a horse and buggy. Once a year, the minister and an elder would go through the congregation, what they called huisbezoek, that's Dutch for home visitation. And they would always announce on Sunday where they would be for different times of the day, 9 o'clock here, 10 o'clock there, and so for dinner. And these people were known for not being real clean, so they tried to arrange it not to ever be there for dinner. But it happened that my dad and Simon Minning were there, and Mrs. Stougham wanted to make coffee and cake for him. And Simon said, "Oh, we never eat cake, I only eat pie." "Oh," she says, "I have pie too." So there he was stuck and had to eat pie there. On that gravel road, once in a while the road grader would go by, and I always thought that was so much fun to watch that go by and scrape the gravel over to the other side of the road. At one time we saw some workmen at each direction from the house, some in the west and some in the east, and they were putting up a sign. And so when they were done, we went over there, and the big yellow sign said, "Church Hill School." In the Corsica High School, they built a brand new gym, and that gym was kind of a room or an auditorium where they could have programs, and so too. My dad took me to a program there one time. I don't have any idea what the program was anymore, but I somehow got away from my dad during the program, and I went up on the bleachers, and I was moving around, I guess, and he tried to get my attention, apparently, but couldn't, and he was really mad at me because I was making too much commotion. Out on the churchyard, there had been a fire earlier. I think one or two of the churches that had sat there before burned down, or one blew away and one burned down, so there was a lot of nails in the ground and people would get flat tires. And my dad would give me a penny for every 100 nails I could find to pick up off that churchyard. We had a garden on the west side of the house. I suppose our garden was maybe a third of an acre or something like that. And one of the neighboring farmers would plow it for us every year, and we would try to raise a garden. And most of the time, it started out nice, and then it would be dry. We were in a series of real dry years there, and then everything would die out before we ever got a crop. And if there was much of a crop, there would be so many insects. There would be potato bugs and beetles out there, and we would go out in the garden, take a can of kerosene, and pick these bugs off the garden plants and dump them in this kerosene, and we'd get a whole can full of these beetles and bugs. Because not many things would grow in the garden, we ate some of the plants that grew wild, like in particular dandelions. And my mom canned a couple hundred quarts of dandelions one year. And evidently one of them was spoiled when we ate it, and my dad got sick, and he went to bed, and Dr. Holman had to come over, and he took one look at Dad and said, "What have you been eating?" And Dad told him, and he said, "What have you been doing for it?" He said, "We've been taking Epsom salts." And the doctor said, "Well, that's good, take some more of them." It was sometime in 1938 that Wilma and Clarence got married, and they made their own flowers out of crepe paper. As I mentioned before, we were all very poor. This was in the height of the Depression years, and so nobody had much money, but I don't think anybody felt bad about it or anything like that. If we would go to town, my favorite place was the hardware store. And if I had a nickel for allowance, what I would usually buy would be a nickel's worth of nails, because I like to pound nails into boards. So we would usually buy that if I had a nickel. The grasshoppers were also real pesty, and they were big, and if a swarm of them would come through, they would just about eat everything, eat all the leaves off the grass and the corn and the weeds, and there'd be nothing but stalks left, and they could come through and eat everything, destroy everything in just a day or two. They'd even eat holes in clothing that was hanging on the clothesline. Once in a while up in the sky you could see just swarms of them that looked like little flecks of silver up in the sky. And if you would drive your car through there, the grasshoppers would hit the windshield and smash on there and just make an awful mess. Many people were out of work, and the government started the WPA, which was the Workmen's Project Association or something like that. I don't know what the A stood for. The project that they were working on there was to build the Corsica Lake in a dam. And we would go over there once in a while and watch them work. And it was mostly all done by hand. The men could get jobs there digging dirt and packing it down and so on. And eventually they got a lake and it filled up. And Paul built a motorboat and had that on the lake. And he just left it out there. And then somebody vandalized it and smashed it to pieces. I had to be taken to the doctor to get a smallpox shot because I suppose he needed it before he went to school. And what an ordeal that was. I didn't know what was coming off, and I can remember really putting up a fight for that. And it took my dad and the doctor both to hold me down while he scratched my arm and scratched this smallpox vaccine into my arm, and it made a big scab about a half-inch across, about the size of a dime or so. And that started to itch after a few days, and I scratched it, and that big core came out, and it left a great big scar on my arm. One of the things that happened during the summertime, we had an awful hailstorm. The hailstones were the size of baseballs, and it was on a Sunday afternoon, and our car was sitting out, and I think Paul had his car there. And cars did not have steel tops then. They had cloth tops, steel sides, but a cloth top that was more or less waterproof. But hailstones like that would go right through a cloth top of a car. So Paul was going to go out and move the car into the shed, so he took a dishpan, held it over his head, and he was going to walk out there. But when those big hailstones hit that, he turned right around and came back in. Well, anyway, the roof of the car was punched full of big holes. Cows were killed out in the field, and most of the cars that were sitting outside got big dents in the hood and fenders as well. So for a long time after that, there were cars around there that had a lot of dents in it from the hailstones. My brothers were big hunters. They would hunt pheasants during pheasant season and rabbits during the winter time. And once in a while I'd get to go along, and I really enjoyed that too. They could shoot about 6 pheasants a day, and some of them could be hens. We're at about 1939 here, and that's the year I started school. My first teacher in first grade was Bertha DeHare. We had just this one-room country schoolhouse. There were 17 students altogether. 5 of us were in first grade. And, of course, the teacher would be with one group at a time and have different kinds of lessons with each grade. And at recess time, we would play outdoors. One was called Andy Over. We'd throw the ball over the roof, and then the team on the other side had to catch it and run around and kind of, I don't know how we did it anymore, but something like that. If it was really nasty weather, we would stay inside, and we had a few games that we played inside. One was kind of like a dart gun, but it would shoot a sucker stick with a rubber suction cup on the target, and I always thought that was so much fun. And we had a sand table. That was just a table with a box of sand in it that we could play in. About Christmas time, Christmas seals would come out, and the school kids would sell those to make money for the Tuberculosis Association. And so we were each issued 10 Christmas seals to go out and sell for a penny apiece. So I came home with them, and my parents bought 5 of them. So then I went on down the road to Joe Hendricks, and they bought 4 of them for 4 cents. And then I went on to Gary High's house and asked them if they'd like to buy Christmas seals. Yeah, they'd buy 10 of them. Well, I said I only have 1 left, so I could only sell them 1 for a penny. I forgot to mention a while ago that if we did have a nickel for allowance once in a great while, not every week, maybe once a month or so, if my parents could afford it, we'd get a nickel. The other thing I like to do is go to the drugstore and buy an ice cream cone. They had Fenn's ice cream, and I really liked that Fenn's strawberry ice cream when it came out. In 1940, we bought a new car. We had a 29 Chevy before that, and then my dad bought a 1936 Plymouth. And I thought that was really a modern car because the windshield slanted instead of being straight up and down. It still had a cloth top, I think, but that was a nice car. And it wasn't too long, and my dad had an accident with it. I don't know whose fault it was, but afterwards the right front fender was dented in, and a piece of rubber from the tire of the other car was caught between the tire and the rim of our car. Dad being a minister, he'd have to marry people, and I remember going to at least 2 weddings. One was Grace and Lyle's, and the other was Everett and Amy DeWard. Down out at the home where the bride lived, a home wedding, and they'd have lunch and so on. I can remember a lot of things about Marvin when he was in high school. He he went out for about every activity there was. He was out for track, and he would practice pole vaulting in our backyard. He rigged up a couple poles with a bar across, and he had a pole that he would take a run and jump over that crossbar. He also had a trombone, and he would practice that a lot. And for typing, he was one of the first ones to probably was the first one to be able to type at the speed of 60 words a minute, and he got a gold pin for that before anybody else did. And Dad had an old Underwood typewriter. My dad would type just with 2 fingers. Paul had a
horse that had white spots. The horse's name was Joyce.
I remember also Marvin had a Model T car. I don't know if he traded his bike for the car or bought it. It seemed like it was about $15. In the town of Corsica were about 4 grocery stores. We never went to Galfin's. We always went to Ohm's and Feninga's, or Feininga's as they called it, and Hank Keel. Paul eventually got a job at Feninga's store in the meat department, and I think that's where he met Margaret. She worked there too. And I remember Paul built a cooler there, a walk-in cooler to store the meat in. Hank Keel he had kind of a butcher shop, but they had a few groceries in the front. And one time Ari DeVries was in there buying cookies. They were bulk cookies, and so Marie was weighing them on the scale, and it couldn't come out to exactly pound. It was a little bit over a pound, and she took the one cookie out, and it was a little less than a pound, so she put it back in, and it was over a pound. She took it off again, and finally Ari said, just break the thing in half, the cookie, that is. Ohm's had a store on the west end of Main Street, and Marvin worked there. Ohm's had all kinds of stuff. They had dry goods like overalls and shoes and cloth and shirts and so on, as well as the usual grocery stuff, but I don't know if they had meat there or not. At the end of the school year, we had a school party, and one of the things they did was give us a bunch of nails to pound into a big log, and another thing, they threw a bunch of pennies out in the yard, and the kids could try and find them. During the summer, they decided to put a basement under the schoolhouse, and so a couple of the farmers nearby came with a team of horses and a scraper that they walked behind the horses, and gradually moved dirt out and dug a big hole, and then they moved the school, built a foundation, and then moved the school over on top of it. Our phone had a crank on it and batteries inside. Our phone number was 5 on 13, and that was a short and a long and a short. You'd have kind of a code for ringing who you wanted to call. And every time anybody got a call, the phone would ring on everybody else that was on the same line, and so everybody else would listen in on them too. When I started second grade, my teacher's name was Muriel Gilreath. I got off to a bad start that year. First day of school, I walked in, and she asked me what I had on my head. Well, it was a cap, but I said, never mind, and I walked out. Well, that made her mad right off, and she marched out there and grabbed me by the neck and bawled me out for that. I don't know why I said that, but I did. It was the first thing that came to my mind. I wore an old coat that Mom had. It was a hand-me-down from somebody else, and Mom made it shorter and cut the sleeves a little bit shorter and kind of sewed it shut, so that's what I had for a coat. My dad's salary was supposed to be $75 a month as the pastor of the church, but people were so poor they usually weren't able, the church was usually not able to pay that much. But the people gave us meat whenever they butchered, and so that helped. My dad got a call to the church in Strasburg, North Dakota, and another call to Willow Lake. I don't know what state that was in, South Dakota or whatever, I'm not sure. And while we were there, I got the measles. So there I was out at somebody else's house, sick with the measles. During the, I think it was summer, my mom and I went to Michigan. We had to take the train, and we started our trip from either Parkston or Tripp, I'm not sure which. And then in Chicago, we had to change trains in that great big train station, and we took what's called a Parmalee, that kind of a big car that would haul people from one train station to another. When we got there, we went to Clarence and Wilma's house, and Dwayne was 5 years old. No, I was 5 years old. I was 5 years older than Dwayne. And Dwayne was maybe 3 years old then. And Dwayne and I slept together in one room. And the next morning, Clarence came to wake us up, and he asked if we heard a baby crying in the night. And I don't think either one of us had, but he said, to Dwayne, you've got a new baby sister, and that's when Sharon had been born. Somewhere along there, Vernon DeVries was climbing in a tree and fell out, and he was in kind of a coma. He couldn't walk or anything. And after about a week of that, my dad told him, why don't you go to the chiropractor with him? So they hauled him to the chiropractor, and the chiropractor adjusted his neck, and he was able to walk out of there, and he was just about fine in no time. On December 7 of 1941, a Sunday afternoon, we were listening to the news. It was just about, I suppose, about 5:30 in the afternoon, because it was about dark already. We had no electricity out in the country, so it was battery-operated radio, and we got the news that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. So we were at war, and that led to a lot of things: gasoline rationing, sugar rationing, meat rationing, and so on. We had to get stamps to get gas and to get food and so on. And I think that's the year, maybe it was the next year, that Marvin DeVries was killed. It was in the morning, and Ari was listening to the radio, and it wasn't working real good, and he thought maybe the vine on the side of the house was tangled up with the antenna or something. So he said to Marvin, would you please go out there and pull those leaves out of the antenna? Well, it turned out that something had gone wrong with the electrical transformer out there, and the metal corners on the corner of the house were somehow in contact with electricity, and when he touched that, it killed him instantly. And that was such a shock to everybody. They didn't have funeral homes, but the body in a coffin would be at the family's home, and so people would stay there all night. And when I looked at that body in the coffin, it looked to me like he was still breathing. And I said to Marie DeVries, it looks like he's still breathing. Yeah, she says, it looks that way to me too. Then the funeral at church was, I remember one thing, that they had to play sing Marvin's favorite song at Calvary. It said something like, years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord is crucified. The next summer, we made another trip to Michigan, and that's when I learned how to ride a bicycle. And I really thought that was fun. We learned it at the home of Rosenbaums. They had a large family, and they had several bikes, and they let me ride it and showed me how to ride. So then I started saving up for a bike of my own. Royce and Roland DeVries became my friends uh, right about there too. I once in a while stayed there overnight, and we had so much fun. We would take our bikes and pedal to Corsica about a mile and a half, 2 miles away, and buy a maple nut ice cream cone. They each had 22 rifles and an old horse we could ride, and they did trapping and so on. And because their mother was in poor health, Royce and Roland had to do most of the housekeeping. We had corn on the cob that night, and so after the meal was done, boys had to do the dishes. And we took the dishes off the table, but the empty corn cobs and all the scraps, we just wrapped it up in the tablecloth and went outdoors and shook it outdoors to the chicken. Under the sink was just a 5-gallon pail. We called it a slop pail, and that caught the dishwater and stuff when we were done. Herman Hoekman, or as he was called in Dutch, Hakkehatem, was a relative of Mrs. de Vries, and he lived there part of the time. And one time he baked a cake for Marie, and she served it at Ladies' Aid. Then the ladies found out who had baked the cake, and they were feasts of it. That meant they thought it was dirty. I remember Herman had a flat tire one time, and he was parked behind the church fixing it, and I happened to see him there, so I went over there and talked to him. And I felt so sorry for him, because there he was sitting there with a flat tire and didn't have any money. And so I went and asked my mom if she could make some food for him. And he was the kind of a guy that he could have people laughing because he didn't have any teeth, and he could stretch his lower lip over the end of his nose, and everybody thought that was so funny. I remember one of the many naughty things that I did. There were a lot of them. After school, all the boys went into Pete Russ's house. Pete Russ was not home. We walked right in the house and did some mischief, like putting salt in with the sugar and that sort of thing. Fortunately, the teacher happened to see us go there and told our parents. And I'm glad now that I was caught. I probably that could have been the life of crime for me. One of the boys at school had a pony, a Shetland pony that he would ride to school. And rode a Shetland pony to school. We found a great big piece of tin and tied it on the pony's tail, and we rode around with the pony pulling that piece of tin. And I think about it, that was kind of mean for the pony to tie it on his tail. Another time we were supposed to get water from Joe Hendricks. We always had to get water for our school from the neighbors. We'd take a pail over there and dip it out of their barrel. Well, he had some goats, and we were riding the goats while we were getting water. And Pete Gruen happened to see it, and he came over and scolded us for that. Another thing we did at school was hunt gophers, and we would pour water down the gopher hole and then beat them with a stick when they came out. I remember another time we went in the cornfield during recess time, and we took some toilet paper and corn silk and made cigarettes, and we smoked them. And the teacher smelled it on us, and she came around and smelled our breath, and I opened my mouth, but I didn't breathe out, so I don't think she smelled it on me. Our teacher was Mrs. Hermina Hoekman in 3rd and 4th grade. And World War II was moving right along here, and she taught us how to make model warships out of the wood that peach crates were made out of, and we'd carve them out and put little matchsticks in for guns and paint them and gray and so on. During the war, we had what we called blackouts at night. Everybody was supposed to turn off all their lights because enemy bombers could use those lights to see where they were going and so on. But Pete and Kreiner Russ never heard the news. I don't know if they even had a radio. So they always had lights on during the blackouts. In 1943, Dad got a call to be the pastor in Dune, Iowa. And as much as I like Grandview, I was sort of glad to leave also. One of the reasons was because some of the older boys at school were very mean to us smaller boys, especially to the preacher's kid. And another thing, we would be living in a nice house with running water and electricity and a bathroom. So in preparation for moving, I saw my parents selling some of the things that they wouldn't need, like the fuel oil barrels and the gasoline motor on our wash machine and so on. So I guess I assumed I had to get rid of everything, and so the few toys and things that I had, I gave away. Also, the cat that I had all these years in Grandview, this black cat that caught so many rabbits and gophers, I was told that cats couldn't move, so we had to leave it behind. And later on, we came back for a visit, and the cat was still there, living under the porch of that house. I also had a dog, a little terrier, rat terrier dog that somebody had given me, and we left. I think we gave that away to someone. And I suppose we sold the goats because I know they didn't come along. So then we moved to Dune, Iowa in about March of 1943. And the parsonage was a big cement block house, 2 stories, 6 rooms upstairs and 6 rooms downstairs in a full basement. We had electricity now. We had running water and a toilet in the house. And now we could get an electric motor for a wash machine and some electric lamps and a few other things. I think we still had the kerosene cooking stove because this was still wartime and it was hard to get much of anything that was made out of metal. I was in 5th grade and went to school in town here about 3 blocks north. My teacher's name was Mina Sculton. Her dad was the mayor. And in a new environment without the goats, my job was to go to the neighbors across the street, the Hoaglands, who had a cow right in town, a cow, maybe a couple pigs too, I'm not sure. It was a dad and an unmarried daughter that lived there, and they were Dutch people, and they tried to talk Dutch to me, which I didn't understand very well. And they'd always call me a kwaad jongen, which means naughty boy. So I told my dad about that, and he said, why don't you just call her an ondeugende meid, which means naughty girl. One of my friends at school, his name was Virgil Slofeld, lived right across from school, and everybody, of course, was interested in the war, and a lot of times there were military airplanes flying overhead, and we each bought a little telescope from Sears for about $1 or so, and we would watch these airplanes, and we'd learn to identify the B-24s and the P-38s and the B-29s and the Flying Fortresses and so on. My brother Marvin was in the Army Air Corps, and his serial number was 17096920. He would save empty cartridges for my ammunition collection, including a 50 caliber machine gun shell that I still have. After school, we would go to either his house, Virgil's house, or my house, and we'd listen to radio programs. There were always programs on for kids after school, and we'd listen to Hop Harrigan and Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, sponsored by Wheaties, the Breakfast of Champions, and all that. And then on Sunday night, on Saturday night at 6:30, the Lone Ranger was on. And most of these programs were sponsored by breakfast cereals, and they'd usually offer some kind of a prize for a couple box tops and 15 to 25 cents. The Lone Ranger offered an atomic bomb ring one time, and that was quite something because it was actually a little spinthariscope, and it consisted of a magnifying glass with a little bit of radioactive material in there, and you could watch, after your eyes got used to the dark, you could watch the little tiny sparks of radioactive disintegrations. I remember when Franklin Roosevelt, our president, died, and in the same year, 1945, the first atomic bombs were tested in Nevada. And it wasn't too long, and they dropped a couple of them on Japan, and that immediately brought the end of the war. Japan surrendered, and the war was over. And slowly things became available again. I remember when the news came that the war was over, the church bells rang all over town. What I really wanted was my own rifle. And before long, I had heard that in the hardware store, 2 of them had come in. And wonder of wonders, my dad would let me buy one. It was a Marlin bolt action with a clip magazine, and it was $12, and I was 12 years old. I did a lot of shooting right in our backyard, which faced the open country. In the spring, after the snow melted, I was wandering around back there in that pasture and found a whole lot of the bullets that I had shot last winter, and they had landed in the snow, and the snow had stopped them without any damage to them, so I picked up all these bullets that were hardly scratched. Everybody was having their tonsils out. If you ever had colds and so on, which I did, you'd have to have your tonsils out. So my dad took me to the next town, Hull, Iowa, where the nurse looked down my throat and advised my dad to have them taken out. So next Monday morning, we went to the hospital. They put me on an operating table, and then the doctor, who had not ever looked at me before, walked in. They strapped me down, and I remember he said, "You don't have to worry, son, your dad's right here with you." They put a rag over my face and poured that awful choky ether in it and told me to blow. Well, when I woke up, I had the most awful sore throat, and I was sick for a week. But I got over it. I wish I still had those tonsils. I like to read. Every week I'd go to the library and get about 6 books to last for the week. I read the whole Nancy Drew mystery series, the Hardy Boys, and a lot of those kinds of books. In the summertime, I went fishing with another friend, Paul Heckman, another preacher's kid whose dad was the pastor in the Christian Reformed Church. There was a gravel pit about a mile south of town, and there were sunfish and rock bass in there, and in my imagination there were some big bass and northerns in there too. And we would walk there and use our worms and just a stick for a fishing pole and a piece of string and some hooks. That was my fishing tackle, and we caught fish. One time I had a stringer of fish hanging in the water, and as I pulled it up when we were going home, there was nothing left but heads, and the turtle, a big snapping turtle, was eating the last fish on there. One day, as Paul and I were walking down the road to go fishing, we went past a house, and there was a boy standing in the yard there. I didn't know who it was, but Paul said to him, "Hi there, Pickle." I guess that was his nickname at school. After he'd walked a little further, a pickup came by and stopped by us, and I didn't know who it was, and the guy asked me if I'd called his son Pickle. I says, "No, I didn't." And it turned out they were members of the Christian Reformed Church, and he just assumed it was me that called his son a Pickle. Sometimes we brought home the fish alive in a pail, and there was an old culvert about 4 feet in diameter and only about 3 feet long, a piece of culvert made of cement laying in our backyard. And so I dug a hole for it and set that culvert in there and put some cement on the bottom and filled it with water, and I had those fish in there. And those fish stayed alive all summer, and once in a while I'd go fishing in there and catch them and throw them back again. I also had a 5-gallon pail with water lilies that somebody gave me, and they were growing there, so I had my own little lake there. On Sunday morning, the church services were in Dutch. And so I didn't have to go. I could stay home. And what I did at home was make model airplanes out of balsa wood and glue and tissue paper. And I also was spent some time working on my stamp collection on Sunday mornings. One of the major things I remember that my dad did with me, just once, was that he drove me to the river, the Rock River, which was a mile or so south of Dune, and he sat with me there while I fished. And I caught the biggest fish I'd ever caught in my life up to that time. It was a 15-inch red horse, which is kind of like a sucker, and it had red fins. About early 1946, my dad got a call to the Reformed Church in Volga, South Dakota, and that's where we moved to next. I was in 7th grade when we got there, and I did not like that school. One of the big reasons was there's some big bullies in there that always beat up on the smaller kids. But I did have some real good friends through the church. They lived on a farm, and I could go over there on Sunday afternoon after church or after school during the week or in the summer. They had a lot of gophers in their pasture, and we would spend some time shooting gophers. They also made the very best homemade ice cream I could ever had up to that time. We had only been in Volga for about 3 months when we were sitting in the kitchen, Mom and Dad and I, on a Saturday afternoon, I think it was. And Dad kind of slumped over on his chair, and we didn't know what was the matter, but Mom said, "I think he's dying." And but after a while, he came to again, and he seemed to be all right. That night, he went ahead and practiced for a wedding, and the next day, he didn't feel good again. And he went to the doctor on Monday, and then he had another one of those spells, and this time it was really worse, and he never did get out of bed again after that. And the doctor said it was called a slow hemorrhage of the brain. So that began a long illness, and there was a drugstore in town, and I had to go get prescriptions for him. And I can remember one time the drugstore in Volga did not have the prescription on hand, so I had to go to Brookings. And I can remember driving to Brookings, maybe 7-8 miles away, to get the prescription for him. Let's see, in 7th grade, I'd be about 13 years old then, I suppose. The druggist and I became friends. He lived right across the road from us, and I think he felt sorry for me. And he just bought a new Buick, and he asked me if I'd like to go for a ride in his new car. Well, I sure did. And so we were driving down the road, and he turned around and spit out the window, but didn't notice that the window wasn't open, and he was so embarrassed. The postmaster also befriended me, and he knew I was a stamp collector, and every once in a while he would put a plate block of 4 new stamps in our mailbox when some of them came out. People were so good to us there. Many friends from previous churches sent money, came to visit, helped with expenses and so on. Dr. Peak never charged anything. A barber came in and shaved my dad, and the chiropractor came over occasionally and gave us all adjustments. By the time school got out in 1947, Dad felt he had to resign from the pastorate, and he went on his pension plan, which he had paid into for many years, and his pension was $1.08 per month, and that's how much we had to live on. So we moved to Holland, Michigan, because that's where Paul and Wilma lived. We had to go by train. We first took an ambulance from Volga to the train station. I think it might have been Lamar's, Iowa, or someplace. And the ambulance, I remember, was an old LaSalle limousine. And we took that train to Chicago. And on the train in the Pullman car, they had what's called a drawing room. It was just like a little tiny room with a bed in it and a couple of benches. So my dad could be in that bed. And when we got to Chicago, Paul met us there with another ambulance from Holland. And we were going to live in a house that my Aunt Agnes was going to let us rent. Dick and Vi Stott had been living in that house, and Agnes had told them they had to move out. So Dick and Vi built a new house of their own. Dick built it himself. And when we got there, and Agnes had changed her mind, she says it would make her too nervous to have my sick dad living there next door. So there were not any houses available. So Paul Margaret had us live with them up above his grocery store at 288 West 19th Street. And we lived there for quite a few months until a house became available at 458 West 19th Street for $20 a month rent. I still remember phone numbers. Wilma's was 52051, Paul's 66451, and ours was 29026. And our furniture had to be stored in Clarence and Wilma's garage during all that time. And it was very damp in Michigan, and I had a collection of these new mint stamps, and they were all ruined because of the dampness. But we made it. I started school in Holland Junior High School in 9th grade. I rode a bike to school, and one night we visited the same Rosenbaums that had taught me how to ride a bike, and I saw the beautiful projects that James had made in shop. And I sure wanted to take shop, but we were late getting there, late enrolling, and all the shop classes were full, so I had to wait till 10th grade for that. It was getting very hard for Mom to take care of Dad anymore. He kept her awake a lot at night, and she had to sleep in the Davenport. So finally, arrangements were made to take Dad to Pine Rest Hospital in Grand Rapids. He did not live long after that. He got pneumonia, and one morning there was a call that he had died. And he had been an invalid like that for a year and a half. After all that, Mom had been given enough money, plus money she earned by babysitting, to make a down payment on a house at 135 East 37th Street in Holland, Michigan, a house that Henry Kleinex had lived in before. And the price was $5,500, payments $20 a month. Paul gave me a job in his grocery store. Started out at 50 cents an hour, which was pretty good pay for that time for school kids. And over the course of several years, he taught me a lot about the grocery business, including meat cutting, produce, cashier. He even let me manage the store when he was gone on vacation. I had to lock up at night, cash out the register, order produce, order meat and stuff. And I guess I didn't realize what a valuable training he was giving me, even though I didn't use it much after that. I eventually saved enough money to buy a Cushman motor scooter to get to work in school. And then I found a used sidecar for it, and I could use that to deliver groceries. And once in a while, I gave my mom a ride in the sidecar as well. We used that motor scooter for a while, and then I got my first car, 1939 Dodge, for $240. It was not a very good car. The motor clattered. It didn't start well in the winter, and it was not the best car. All those years, we survived on very little money, but a lot of goodness from Christians and from God.